Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's been a hot minute, but here I am in my own official garage with electricity, with a power door, with our little Toyota. And that's about the garage, but in this one, we're going to be doing some carburetor work. Specifically, comparing carbs. If your car happens to be running wrong and you want to know some simple things to fix it, the easiest things to look into, what I had to go through when my car sat for 20 years and I had to revive it from the grave, and what aftermarket options there are for carbs for the AE82 4A Corollas. For starters, your carburetor on your 4A engine is going to be located underneath this air cleaner lid, which is held down by a bolt here. This is a replacement bolt. The original one would have looked a little different. Wing nut there. It'll be attached to your air ducting. This is also aftermarket, done by me because the mice destroyed that all. And from the factory, there'll be a pipe that runs down to your exhaust. Off of that, it just lets exhaust in for sort of like an air pump system or a carb heat system. I don't really understand what it's for, but it's no longer there, but it'd be a hose, a pinch hose clamp you got to undo and wiggle it off there. Underneath the air lid, you'll find a sort of breather line here for the crankcase vent, and you'll find a vacuum line that runs to the base of the carb that goes up to this little vacuum diaphragm on the bottom of the air cleaner. You just got to pull that guy out, make sure this disconnects. This doesn't really pull any vacuum, it's just a vent into the bowl. And then it lifts up, and there's the carburetor. Another thing to mention is from the factory, on the right side here, there would be this metal flex piping that would route down to your exhaust manifold. This would let in hot air for a cold start off the exhaust manifold's heat shield. It wouldn't route into the exhaust, but it'd route off the heat shield, letting hot air travel up to the air lid to help warm up the carb on a very, very cold start. You also don't need this, and you can get away without having it. Looks like after various rebuilds and improvements done by me in an attempt to keep it running as best as I could, you'll see some things don't look quite like they should, maybe. Some things are missing. More on that guy later. Some things have been disconnected completely. More on that later. Otherwise, more things like that. More on that later. Otherwise, this is it. This is what a carburetor looks like on these, the feedback carburetor system. Upon popping the hood, you'll see the carburetor will sit just like this. These two diaphragms facing you. The solenoid will be facing you. The fuel line will be going to the fuel pump right there. This PCV line that goes to your PCV valve, more vacuum routing, wing nut, etc. Yeah, this is how it sits right here. Over to your left side, you'll see another breather here. That's for your evap line. It's just vents from the canister right into there. You'll see a sight glass, like a lot of the old school carburetors have back in the day. This one here is pretty gunked up. You can't really see it, so if you take it apart to rebuild, make sure to wipe that guy down. You'll see down here your idle position switch, I guess you could call it. That car didn't have one on its carburetor. This one did. There's a spot for it, so I'm not sure what happened for it. Supposedly it acts like an idle position switch. I mean, it just tells you what position your idle's in, but it doesn't really move necessarily for me. It's like stuck, so I don't know what that does with the circuit. Not really an explanation, but it is there, and there's a plug for it. It's just a little guy. It's a little single wire one. You'll see more springs here. Stuff for your AC idle up goes right here. This right here is for, I have it bent out of the way, but to reduce emissions when you rev it up, instead of just dropping fast and backfiring or whatever. This kind of dampens the return of the throttle to give it more of a woo, like an easier comeback from revving. Mine was getting caught on that car, causing it not to want to accelerate. So I just took it out of the way, bent it out of the way. You can leave these lines connected, it'll just kind of pull on it. All right, so the right side of the carb, it's kind of a mess here, but it can be explained. So we have this diaphragm here. That's part of your choke circuit. I'll talk about that later. We have this diaphragm here. That is for your vacuum secondary. There is no mechanical secondary on this carburetor, on these Corollas. It's all vacuum, so there's a little gasket in there. If it goes bad, you won't have your vacuum secondary, and your car won't want to run very great. Over here, we have kind of this crazy looking mechanism. This is actually your idle up cog, I guess you could call it. Supposed to be able, when you rev it up from a cold start, this thing will slowly kind of clock down your idle speed. It's supposed to kind of have a springiness to it, but like you rev it up, it goes through its full thing. As time goes on, this slowly moves and lets your throttle kind of lower and go to a smaller RPM. This mechanism doesn't really work on this, so it's kind of hard to demonstrate. That's what that's for. It's right there. Here your TV cable for your transmission goes if you have an automatic. If you have a manual, don't worry about it, which is off of a manual car, but it still has it. Then your throttle cable goes right in here. Here you have your electric choke. From the factory on this carburetor, on these Corollas, it is, at least in America, they are riveted off. So they don't really want you to change the position of this in case your spring wears out or anything. They want it to be just like that. On that car, it wasn't working anymore, so I just drilled the rivets out, put my own screws in there. That way, like an old school carb, I was able to tension the choke to my liking. But this one actually has a decent amount of tension. Mine was very, very loose, and it just wasn't helping my car run at all. All right, so the back of the carb, which is going to be up against the firewall, it'll look something like this. You'll see all your wires are kind of routed to be held in with this kind of clamp here, just to tuck it all in and keep it tidy looking. You'll see another fuel cutoff solenoid right here. This one's a 2-wire one. That one on the front is just a 1-wire one. It grounds to the carb. This one has a separate ground than the ECM, our emissions computer, I guess you could call it. This right here is going to be your normal idle screw. It looks just like this really long bolt. It screws, the threads are in the base of the carb there. And if you're able to peek through, clear in there, you'll see those threads kind of in the middle of my screen. Well, those threads are what idles up the carb. And if I turn this thing, you'll see it turning. That's what idles up your carburetor. So if it's idling too low, you go and turn it. Idling too high, you go and loosen it. Just like that. Easy to see, easy to feel with your hands. Simple. Down there, you'll see this little itty-bitty guy, this flathead. That is for your fast idle. So when you start it up, and this cam here is maxed out like it's supposed to be. All right, I just tightened the, I just turned up the fast idle screw there. So when that thing's all the way engaged, that little flathead screw goes into this little spring there. It's hard to make out. But if you have the car running, you can turn it when it's cold, and you will, in fact, hear it run quicker. It'll have a higher RPM at idle. Basically, it kind of puts tension on this, which allows this cam here to go to the highest setting. And when the choke warms up, this thing and vacuum starts applying to everything. This cog just slowly lets up. You can kind of see everything kind of loosening up. And eventually, it'll be down to a normal RPM. And this guy becomes the main screw to run everything. In fact, when you have the fast idle set, if you look in there, if I can try to find it, If you look in there, you will see that the screw is no longer touching the throttle. So it's all in the fast idle now, which is what that little Phillips on the back. So those are the main two adjustments you'll be making on this kind of car. So here's how that idle breaker works properly. So car's warmed up, it's running off of that little idle, fast idle screw. As it warms up, throttle will start to detent. Once, twice, 3 times. It's warming up, and then it now relies on the bigger screw. All those should do that. They're just old and worn out, so it's not as easy to tell, but everything's working properly. It should look just like that off of a full cold start. Over here, we'll have a bunch of vacuum lines. One goes to your evap system, other ones go to your EGR stuff. Your valves are all right here, and your EGR modulator are right there on your exhaust manifold. And then those will go to your different emissions things, those top two there. But yeah, basic stuff. If they're not hooked up, they're going to be causing a vacuum leak, so just make sure to plug them up. Down there, you'll see a faint circle. It looks like it's pretty flush with the body of the carb. Behind that is your idle mixture screw. From the factory, they do not want you touching that, which is why it is capped off like that. But if you're kind of thinking that your idle mixture is off after fully rebuilding the carb, making sure your float's set correctly, that the solenoids are working correctly, you think it's still running rich or lean, you can drill into that and tap, pull that plug out and adjust that screw. I believe from the factory it's 3.5 turns out. I'll have to correct myself later on that. But yeah, so that's what it is. If nothing else, if all else fails and the car still runs rich or lean, you might want to look into that. On that carburetor, I have looked into that. So it is open and exposed, which we'll see on the counter here in a little bit. Right here is your accelerator pump diaphragm. There's a little boot there. It threads in the top of the carb. It hooks in to the accelerator pump like that, a little pin there. And then it goes to your throttle assembly right there. A lot of these cars, the bushing will completely disintegrate. In fact, this one's kind of messed up too. There's really no aftermarket one that's technically for it. So on that car, it wasn't on there and it just would not accelerate right. Like you'd rev it and it just fall on its face and die. Because there's no fuel being forced into the carb. So when you press that, you see it kind of sinks. And there are adjustments. You can adjust the accelerator pump by bending this metal line to kind of have more of an angle. That'll allow it to have more throw. Before, on that other car, I'd do that and it wouldn't really move up at all. You kind of see that spring is collapsing and the pin is moving up and down. This is a pretty good adjustment. Like you're pressing it, it's pumping fuel in there manually. So if you're having problems, always check that too. Then you got one more vent line right here. All right, now let's explain what some of these things do on this carburetor. So starting at the front here, very basic stuff. When you start the car, your choke is going to be completely closed. So when you give it gas, that cog will try to keep it open, but there's still spring tension on here, as you can see. It is fully shut. Idle should be turned all the way up. It's still shut, which will just choke your car out and flood it, and it would just die. So there's going to be vacuum applied here on this, and if you want to see if this leaks, you can actually just put your mouth on that and suck on it, and then I'll pull this, and that little guy right there will have vacuum on it constantly. You start the car, and it'll open it up just enough to give it air to not flood out your car. So as it's warming up, this is always held open. This thing is heating up, getting that spring to be nice and loose eventually, so it's not as tight. Car's idling, fast idling. This cam, like I showed you earlier, will start to detent and get to a low RPM. Once the car reaches a certain coolant temperature, Another vacuum line will apply vacuum right here from the thermostatic vacuum switching valve. It'll suck on this, and this here, as you can see, will pull that wide open. So I'm pretending my finger is vacuum. So this thing will be on, pretend that's open. You can see they kind of work in conjunction. This flap is the choke flap right over here, right over there. Vacuum will apply and hold that wide open. So now you're on your big idle screw. The car's idling at its normal RPM. This thing should be wide open. And this thing will have constant vacuum on it and keep it that way. So say I let off and it stayed open there. So when, let's say you park the car, you're shopping for a while, everything cools off, right? You'll press the gas once or twice. That'll shut back to let your car choke itself out and let the idle go back to its fast warm-up idle, and then you start the car. The process will start over again. So on these, you need to make sure that your choke is working properly. Otherwise, the car just will not run right. Can you force it to run right with the choke stuck open? Yes, but if you want it to be proper, you got to make sure at least this is getting vacuum and that at least is getting vacuum. And you also got to make sure that this thing is warming up. You can simply do that by checking for power here with the key on, or feeling it with your hand. You will burn yourself, and that'll be working. The basics of the choke diaphragms. So over here to your left, you'll have this little vacuum pod. It's hard to explain, but basically when you give it gas quickly or on the highway to reduce emissions, the fuel-injected cars have this too. It will make your throttle return back slowly. So if you're like revving it, it won't just return back to idle. It won't just drop quickly like you see some tachometers do. It'll just slowly descend. That's to reduce some NOx emissions, blah, 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 to reduce backfiring. Sometimes there's 3 lines here. These go to like your high altitude and your other emission stuff. There's one in here that mainly does it for just normal daily driving. Something will get messed up in there, and for me, I would go to accelerate and it wouldn't go back. Like it would not let my throttle return, period. It was just messed up. So I just took the liberty of bending it out of the way. So now when you rev it, it goes back, it'll backfire, whatever, race car stuff. But that's the main purpose of that thing. Doesn't really do much other than that. If you want to cap it off, you could get away with it, and the car would be just fine without it. Over to the right of the car, we're going to have the vacuum-operated secondary. So to demonstrate, your throttle's wide open. This thing will pull a vacuum internally to the carb, so there's no line that goes to this. Let's say you're giving it gas, you're trying to get up to highway speed. This thing will allow this to move freely when you're giving it heavy throttle, and this vacuum will start to pull and open that flap. On my carburetor, on this car, I could not accelerate without giving it like a quarter throttle. Any heavy throttle, it just would not run, period. What had happened was this mechanism here was very gunked up, and this throttle blade here would not move freely. It was basically seized shut. So I cleaned it out with carb cleaner, let it soak, and I sprayed PB Blaster or Deep Creep in there to let this thing start to free back up. And after that, my vacuum secondary was working great, and I could actually accelerate. This diaphragm here can go bad too. Some of the kits include that as well. Of course, make sure your little bushings are out. If they're broken or busted out, then, and if the pin's not in there, it'll just fall out when you're on the highway, and that will not be good. Otherwise, that should look something like that. It's hard to see it when it's in the car running, but if you take it out, you can just pretend and make sure it operates like that. Make sure nothing's binding up or anything with your manual throttle blade. And then how vacuum applies is if you take this off, you'll see a little kind of O-ring, square O-ring gasket in there in the middle of those 2 screws down for that. And that is what applies your vacuum internal to the carb. If that O-ring goes bad, you'll have a vacuum leak there, and this thing won't work properly, and your carb will probably run like crap. But yeah, that is the vacuum secondary throttle blade diaphragm. On the back of the carb, by the firewall, there's only one real vacuum thing left, and that is this auxiliary accelerator pump diaphragm. It's an itty bitty little diaphragm. If this starts leaking, fuel will actually get sucked into your engine, into your car, into your engine, and it'll cause it to run rich. The kits include new diaphragms, and a lot of guys actually just plug them off because they don't really do anything anyway. So that's what that looks like. This is itty bitty little diaphragm on the back of the carb for your auxiliary accelerator pump. I don't think it really does anything, honestly, but it's there, so they put it there. All right, on to the electronics. So right here, dead front and center, you'll see this little cylinder looking thing. Well, that is a idle, people call them idle mixer solenoids, people call them fuel cutoff solenoids. What do I think they are? I believe that they're just strictly fuel cutoff solenoids or anti-dieseling solenoids. So when you turn the car off, it doesn't let fuel pass, and the car will sit and try to idle when the ignition's off. Well, this thing keeps fuel out of a chamber. When it's off, when it's on, it lets the fuel flow, lets the car run normally. I don't know why they couldn't figure out just to not have it, but it's there. This one here is a one wire. So power is going to go through here. 12 volts should be applied there. This one grounds to the threads to the body of the carb, and it'll go up to your carburetor plug like that. It'll be this black and white striped wire for the front one. On the right side of the carb, we'll have another one, except for this one's kind of different. It has two wires. One's ground. It grounds internally to your emissions computer. And the other black and white wire there is your power. So 12 volts should be applied there, etc. This one doesn't ground to the body of the carb for some reason, but in case your ground goes bad, you can actually just put it to a ground anywhere in the whole engine bay and it'll work normally. If these don't work properly, you may see your car kind of idle and run not right. It'll be running really weird. Be idling all wrong, really, because those passages need that fuel. So if they're shut, it's not getting fuel in the right places. It'll be starved of fuel. It'll run lean. It won't run right. Another problem that can happen is that these wires can easily get exposed. On the 88 Corolla there, it was actually exposed, and it was shorting out on the accelerator pump lever here and blowing my engine fuse. So all my electricity to all these components was not working. My choke wasn't opening properly, causing a bunch of problems. And this is really a pain in the butt to solder when the wire breaks off right on the edge. It's a pain in the butt, but we tried to make it work. And it somewhat did for a while. The front one's only got one wire to worry about, but if you're decent at soldering, you can try to make them work. Otherwise, some people on the internet actually sell these, normally, and they're in Australia and different countries, but in case you want to try starting over, a lot of guys at Toyota trucks, they also have these on their carburetors. They will buy these to try to fix it. Or you can try an alternate method of finding the same thread, the bolt with the same thread, the same length, and just threading it into there. That way, your passageway right there is still open. The bolt's got to end right where the thread's in. That way your passageway is still open and you're still letting fuel flow. However, when you shut the car off, it'll try to diesel and keep running, which can be super annoying. And sometimes it'll even kind of flood the engine. So when you go to start it next, the plugs will be full of gas and it'll try to run like 3 cylinders. So it can kind of cause problems. On that car, it is kind of a problem. It's not running right anyway, so I'm not sure if that's the sole cause, but it is there. And we can test these as well. All you got to do is make sure your rubber O-ring is good and fresh and not letting gas get through it. And all you got to do to test them is apply power to your power wire and ground out the base, or in this case, this is a 2-wire, so you can just ground out the other wire, and listen for a click. That's all you got to do. Listen for a click. You can do it inside the car. You can have a friend turn the key on. You can sit and hold it, listen to it. It'll click. Or if it's the one that's held in the base, you can just unplug everything else, the other solenoid, turn the key on, listen for a click. If it's not windy out or anything, it's a nice quiet spot, you can hear it click. And normally that is a kind of confirmed it working, but it doesn't hurt to take it out and spray it with carb cleaner, let it soak too, just in case it's not working. And it might not work. It might click, but it might also not work. It's just really hard to say. Normally they're pretty reliable and they do work, but there's a chance that they couldn't. That's what I think's going on over there, but not too sure. Of course, we have our electric choke. Every carburetor pretty much has one of these if it's not a regular cable-operated choke. 12 volts gets applied to this. It grounds to the carb. As the longer the car runs, this thing warms up. It's a coil spring in there. It loses the tension on this because the windings just kind of loosen up. This thing gets real flappy and loose, which lets the vacuum here apply that much easier. If this wire is frayed, it can short out. If the wire is frayed, the car, it'll run, but it's very likely that when everything is pushing, it's just going to want to try to close back shut. There was one time that the wire had frayed at the plug for me. I went to leave, not even 30 seconds after leaving my driveway, the car just died. It had flooded because the wire had frayed and I lost voltage here. This thing cooled down. This thing just went shut, or tried to shut itself, and just stayed open like this. Anyway, it just flooded the carb. The car died like a mile from my house. Had to push it back. It was really embarrassing. But yeah, make sure you got a good connection here. 12 volts right there. 12 volts at your connector. Simple stuff. Last but certainly not least, we have the oddity, this supposed idle position sensor switch. It's got one wire. There's a plug for it on that car, but that car's carb did not have one. This one's did. I guess it tells some sort of information to the emissions computer about the throttle position, but that car ran great without one, so I don't really know what it does. And but our lovely Haynes manual doesn't really say anywhere about it. It mentions it. Unplugging the switch, catalytic converter stuff. So I don't know. It should have a purpose, but on my car, it wasn't even there at all. There's the spot for it. Like, it was there at one point, but it didn't do anything. And I don't know if it's supposed to be. This one's kind of seized. I mean, you can see me kind of messing with it here. I'm imagining it's supposed to be springing out up against this linkage here, but I can kind of push it in and it's like stuck. So yeah, if you guys run into anything about that and maybe it does do something important, let me know. But I think you can take the thing off and get away with it and be just fine. Otherwise, that concludes all of the electronics on the 4A engine's carburetor. Not too crazy when you kind of narrow everything down, but these things can cause a problem. You can try to eliminate them. You need your electric choke. The throttle position switch, probably don't need, and you should be okay. All right, here we have the two carbs side by side. This one's off of a 1987 Corolla FX with the 5-speed manual. This is off of my 88 with the 3-speed automatic. So as you can see, they are pretty much identical, because they are. Only things that have been changed are modifications I've done, like I said. As you can see, still have the rivets, has screws. See my angles. It's clocked a bit earlier than that one for more tension. Let me start that over. So yeah, there's that. Both of these have had the same treatment with the accelerator pump spring there. The bushing was disintegrated, so I kind of took my own liberties on those. From what I know of, there's no bushing kits, but maybe there is. I don't know. On the back, you'll see that the idle screw looks totally different than the factory one. That's because when I got the car, it actually didn't even have an idle screw. It was idling, I don't know how, but it was idling so low, like lower than the spec, but the car was still able to idle. But when you gave the gas, it would kind of just die from all the other problems that I had, but it didn't have an idle screw at all, which was crazy to me. And I never would have known, because no one really had any information on it. But in there, you'll see the threads hidden in there. So I had to make my own. Just had to go to the store, get that thread pitch, really long threaded bolt, and put this little nut on there. It's much looser than it needs to be, but it still gets the job done. I can still stick my hand back there and feel the idle screw the same way. So that's been done. Other thing that's been done, you'll notice the fuel shutoff solenoid there. It's not on here. That's because I thought that those were my problem, my running problem. So I took them out, did what I said, where I found a bolt of that similar thread, put a washer there. Oh, there's also going to be a gasket there, so make sure yours have their gasket. It'll cause a leak. And I put the bolts in, so there's always fuel going through those passages. It's always getting gas where it needs to be. I think it runs a bit rich, way too rich, maybe. I did it on both. Where's the other one at? Yeah, right here in the front. Did it on both. So if you look down here, see a nice shiny bolt. If you look on here, you see a big ugly solenoid. I did the bolt method on both. My car still doesn't really run great, so I can't really say if that's a good fix for sure, but I did try it, so I had deleted these solenoids, if you will. I guess that's what you would say, what do you call that? See on here, the float glass is a lot clearer. That one's all gunked up. That's where the idle mixture screw is. You can see it in there. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it's 3.5 turns out, but untampered, tampered with, untampered, tampered with. There's that auxiliary accelerator pump. There's a diaphragm. There's the gasket for your air lid. This one stays on this carb. This one stays on the air lid. So, other thing to note is all these bushings will disintegrate if you're taking this thing apart enough times and rebuilding it. You'll break something eventually. The parts store does sell little bushings that you can make work basically, and I have had to on several things like that. Should be looking like that. There also be green like that. You know, that one's white. Those ones are all blown out on the accelerator pump. If I look around long enough, I can find more that I've broken. One right there on the accelerator pump. That one's important too. You don't want that one blowing out on you. But otherwise, most of the bushings hold up. Unless you mess with them enough times, you will end up breaking something. When I first got this, there's supposed to be a little one-way check valve on the that choke pull-off diaphragm. It was actually clogged shut. It was actually frayed in half too. So I had a vacuum leak there. Even when it was hooked up, it wasn't letting any vacuum through. So this was not even letting air pass at all. My car was just choking. This thing was constantly closed until it warmed up. Then it would open and let fuel. But off fresh idle, this needs to be open a little bit. The only thing that's going to open that is this one here. So make sure that all your lines have good vacuum and aren't leaking or anything. And I just took the check valve out and it works great. So I'm not worried about it at all. There's that throttle position switch on the one carb. As you can see, spot for it, but it's not there. So either somebody decided, oh, and this is bent. So somebody decided that they didn't want it there, so it's not there. I don't think this car had the problem with the throttle sticking for that easy off deal, so I just bent it out of the way anyway. If yours isn't giving you any problems and you want a softer return on your revs, then you can leave it there, but I just undid it for race car stuff. That guy just puked gas everywhere. So yeah, that about sums up the carb. As long as you do a thorough rebuild, get a new gasket set, O'Reilly sells them, Rock Auto sells them. Kind of do the general things that I did, clean out all the rust, clean out all the passages, blow through the passages with compressed air if you have to, soak it overnight in Chem Dip. They're probably going to run pretty good. But if you're having some symptoms, for sure, go through the things that I told you about, and you're bound to get some results. All right, that about sums it up. Of course, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns regarding anything wrong with your AE82 Corolla with the 4ALC, feel free to leave a comment and at me or whatever, and hopefully I can try to give you some insight into this. I know it's a lot to lay out in one time, but if you go through everything just like I did, I mean, you'll have a somewhat fully functioning carburetor. But yeah, hope you guys like this one. Of course, like and subscribe. If you have friends with these cars, show them the video if you want to learn something about carbs, or show people how terrible 80s carbs are. You know, share the video, like the video. Now, that being said, we'll get to doing more projects on this thing. Catch you next time. See ya.